The wedding hall froze. With a cruel smile, the millionaire's wife pointed across the room. "My maid Amara will perform for us," she announced. All eyes turned to the young, pregnant maid as she was forced onto the stage. What began as public humiliation would soon turn into her greatest triumph. Before we dive in, tell me where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories of dignity and justice. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, their crystal edges scattering light across polished marble floors. A string quartet played softly in the corner while waiters in crisp uniforms floated between tables dressed in satin cloth and gold trim. The guests, politicians, business moguls, and socialites laughed over champagne, their voices rising in a chorus of privilege. For the city's elite, this was more than a wedding. It was a display of power. At the center of it all stood Elaine Whitmore, the bride. Her gown sparkled with imported diamonds, her fingers weighed down by jewelry that could have paid off the debts of an entire neighborhood. She smiled, but it was a smile sharpened by vanity and control. For Elaine, beauty wasn't enough. Domination was her truest accessory. Behind the curtain of extravagance, in a quieter corner of the estate, stood Amara. She was a young black woman in her mid-20s, visibly pregnant, her belly stretching against the simple uniform she wore. She was the Whitmore's maid, but tonight, her role extended far beyond serving. She had been summoned for something humiliating, something she had no power to refuse. Amara had always carried herself with grace. Even when scrubbing floors or balancing trays of porcelain, she hummed softly under her breath. Singing was her comfort, a gift from her grandmother who had raised her with lullabies that carried history, hope, and survival in their melodies. It was the one thing Amara had that the world couldn't take, until tonight. Elaine had overheard her singing days before the wedding, her voice filling the kitchen like sunlight. Rather than see it as beauty, Elaine saw it as entertainment. So when her wedding day arrived, she decided Amara would perform, not as a guest, but as a spectacle. As the guests settled, Elaine clapped her jeweled hands. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice slicing through the chatter, "we have a special performance tonight. Something unique, something raw." She turned, her eyes settling on Amara. "Our maid has the voice of an angel. And tonight, she will sing for us." A murmur spread across the hall. Some laughed, some leaned forward in curiosity. Amara froze, the weight of dozens of eyes pressing down on her. Her cheeks flushed as her hands instinctively went to her stomach. She hadn't been asked, she had been ordered. Refusing was not an option. She stepped hesitantly toward the center of the ballroom. The music stopped. All eyes were on her, her uniform stark against the glittering gowns and tailored suits. She felt exposed, diminished, yet something inside her refused to crumble. She inhaled, and the first note left her lips. Her voice was soft at first, fragile as glass, but it carried. The melody rose, trembling with emotion. Guests shifted in their seats, surprised at the depth of sound emerging from a woman they had never truly seen before. Amara closed her eyes, singing not for them but for herself, for her unborn child, for her grandmother, for every moment of indignity she had endured. But Elaine wasn't satisfied. She leaned back in her chair, whispering loudly enough for those nearby to hear, "Look at her. A maid, pregnant and barefoot in spirit, and yet she thinks she's a star." Her laughter rippled through the air, cutting into Amara's song. Amara's voice wavered, but she pressed on. Tears stung her eyes, not of shame but of defiance. Each note became heavier, richer, vibrating with strength that came not from applause, but from survival. She finished the song with her head held high, her final note echoing against the marble until silence fell. For a moment, no one spoke. The guests, so accustomed to polished performances and rehearsed glamour, had felt something raw, something real. And then the silence broke, not with applause, but with a slow, deliberate clap. It came from the groom, Henry Whitmore. A millionaire, older than Elaine by nearly 20 years, his presence carried authority that money alone could not buy. His clap was steady, unyielding, and soon others reluctantly joined. The applause spread, but it wasn't for Elaine's display, it was for Amara's courage. Elaine's smile faltered. This wasn't the reaction she had envisioned. She had wanted laughter, mockery, a reminder of her control. Instead, her husband's eyes lingered on Amara, not with desire, but with respect. Amara bowed slightly, her dignity intact, and turned to leave. But Henry rose from his seat. "Amara," he called, his deep voice commanding attention. "Please stay." Elaine's jaw tightened. This was not part of her script. Henry walked toward Amara, his steps echoing across the ballroom. He looked at her belly, then back into her eyes. "You sang with more truth tonight than all the music I've ever heard in these halls. No one should be forced to give their gift like that. And yet you did with grace." Gasps whispered through the room. Elaine's face burned with rage, but Henry continued, his voice growing stronger. "From this day forward, Amara will never serve as a maid in this house again. She deserves better, and I intend to make sure she gets it." The room erupted in shock. Elaine's hands trembled as she clutched her dress. Guests exchanged glances, torn between scandal and admiration. Amara stood frozen, unable to process what had just been said. For the first time that night, the power in the room shifted, not from wealth, not from status, but from dignity reclaimed in the face of humiliation. And this was only the beginning of Amara's story. The ballroom never quite recovered from that moment. Whispers spread like wildfire, weaving themselves into the fabric of the evening. What was meant to be Elaine's night of triumph had been hijacked, not by scandal or spectacle, but by the undeniable presence of truth. Amara had not only sung, she had revealed the fragility of the world Elaine had tried so hard to control. Elaine's eyes burned with fury, but she forced a smile for the cameras flashing nearby. Appearances had to be maintained, at least until the last guest departed. Yet inside, her anger curled into something darker, a determination to remind Amara of her place. But Henry was unshaken. In the days that followed, he made good on his promise. He released Amara from her duties in the Whitmore household, ensuring she would no longer be treated as a servant. More than that, he offered her an opportunity, a stipend to support her pregnancy, and access to contacts who could help her pursue her singing more seriously should she choose. At first, Amara was hesitant. She had lived long enough to know that gifts from the powerful often came with strings attached. But Henry's gesture felt different. It wasn't pity, it was recognition. He saw her not as a maid, not as a token performance, but as a human being with worth that could not be bought or diminished. Elaine, however, seethed. To her, Amara's rise was an insult, a crack in the flawless glass of her social standing. In hushed conversations with her circle of friends, she dismissed the applause that night as charity, sneered at Henry's generosity as misplaced guilt, and vowed that Amara would never escape the shadow of that humiliation. But Amara had already decided otherwise. For too long, she had allowed her life to be dictated by the hands of others, by employers, by circumstance, by the quiet weight of inequality. Now, carrying a new life inside her, she understood that her dignity was not negotiable. The humiliation of being paraded before strangers had not broken her. It had revealed her strength. Months passed. Amara gave birth to a baby girl, whom she named Leora, Light. Every night, she sang to her child the same way her grandmother had sung to her. Her voice, once confined to kitchens and laundry rooms, now filled her modest apartment, growing stronger with each passing day. She began to perform at local community gatherings, her songs carrying stories of struggle and hope that resonated deeply with audiences who knew what it meant to be overlooked. Word spread. Invitations came. Soon, Amara was no longer just a maid who had been forced to sing at a wedding. She was a voice people sought out, a symbol of resilience. Henry attended one of her performances quietly, sitting in the back of a crowded church hall. When Amara's song ended, he didn't approach her, didn't make himself known. He simply sat in the shadows, clapping with the rest of the audience. To him, her journey wasn't his to shape, it was hers to own. Elaine, on the other hand, could not bear the humiliation of seeing Amara celebrated. She tried to spread rumors, whispering lies into the ears of the elite, suggesting that Amara's success was bought, that her voice was nothing more than a novelty. But the more Elaine tried to smear her, the stronger Amara's reputation grew. People weren't drawn to her because of wealth or status. They were drawn to her truth. Years rolled on. Amara's daughter grew, inheriting not just her mother's voice, but her sense of pride. Together, they became a force in their community, Amara through her music, and Leora through her activism as she grew older. They spoke at rallies, lent their voices to causes that fought against the same kind of humiliation Amara had once endured. And then one evening, a letter arrived. It bore the city's official seal, inviting Amara to perform at a public ceremony honoring local leaders who had made significant contributions to justice and cultural dignity. Among the honorees, Judge Lorraine Jacobs, a name that carried weight in the fight for equality. Amara accepted, though nerves fluttered in her chest. This wasn't a private gathering or a church hall. This was a stage where the city itself would listen. The night of the ceremony, as Amara stepped onto the stage, she looked out at the crowd, a sea of faces, some familiar, some not, all waiting. For a moment, her mind flickered back to that ballroom years ago, the chandeliers, the laughter, the sting of humiliation. But tonight was different. Tonight, she stood not as a maid forced to perform, but as a woman who chose to sing. Her voice rose, steady and strong, carrying across the square. Every note was a testament, not just to her own survival, but to every black woman who had been told her place was beneath dignity. The audience stood, not with polite applause, but with roaring affirmation. And as Amara finished, she felt something she had never felt before, not just respect, but belonging. Elaine Whitmore watched from afar. Time had not been kind to her. Wealth had faded, her marriage had dissolved, and her influence had crumbled. She stood on the edges of the crowd, unnoticed, her bitterness now her only companion. She saw Amara, radiant and powerful, and for the first time understood the depth of her loss. What Elaine had tried to use as humiliation had become the very foundation of Amara's triumph. Later that night, as Amara cradled Leora and looked out at the city lights, she whispered, "We were never small. They just couldn't see us." Her daughter, wide-eyed and proud, leaned against her and said, "Mama, they see you now. And they'll never forget." And indeed, they didn't. Amara's name became more than a story, it became a legacy. A reminder that dignity stolen can be dignity reclaimed, that voices silenced can rise louder than ever, and that even in the face of cruelty, grace can turn shame into triumph. Her journey was not one of revenge, but of transformation. And for generations to come, her song remained, not just in recordings or retellings, but in the hearts of those who understood its power. Because Amara had proven one truth above all: humiliation may wound, but it cannot define. Courage, dignity, and resilience, that is what endures.